Japan, a land of mountains and sea, of cherry blossoms and typhoons, of emperors and warriors. Today, it is known as one of the most advanced and influential nations in the world. But Japan's story did not begin with skyscrapers, bullet trains, or flashing neon lights. It began thousands of years ago, shrouded in myth, legend, and the whispers of ancient gods. To understand Japan, we must go back not just centuries, but millennia, to the very first day of its history. According to legend, Japan was born when the gods Izanagi and Izanami dipped a jeweled spear into the ocean. From the droplets that fell, islands rose from the sea. These islands became the Japanese archipelago. And from this divine beginning came the imperial line of Japan, said to descend from the sun goddess Amaterasu herself. It is this mythological connection that gave rise to Japan's first emperors, and why Japan would forever be called the land of the rising Sunday. But beyond the legends, archaeologists trace Japan's earliest human inhabitants back to over 30,000 years ago. Nomadic hunter-gatherers crossed from the Asian mainland into these islands. Over time, they developed unique cultures, most famously the Jomon period, beginning around 14,000 before Common Era. The Jomon people were skilled at pottery. Some of the oldest pottery in the world comes from Japan. They lived in pit dwellings, hunted deer and boar, gathered nuts, and fished along the coasts. Then came the Yayoi period around 300 before Common Era, when a great wave of change swept across Japan. Migrants from the Asian mainland, likely from Korea and China, brought with them rice cultivation, metal tools, and new social structures. Farming transformed life in Japan. Villages grew larger, hierarchies developed, and new technologies began to spread. This was the beginning of what we might call Japanese civilization. By the 3rd century Common Era, Japan entered what is known as the Kofun period. This era is marked by giant burial mounds, massive tombs built for powerful rulers. One of the largest, the tomb of Emperor Nintoku, stretches longer than the Great Pyramid of Giza. It was during this time that Japan began to form into a more centralized society, with emerging kings and clans laying the foundation for the imperial line. The Japanese imperial house, claiming descent from the gods, became the central thread of Japan's identity. Unlike many royal dynasties that rise and fall, Japan's imperial line remains the oldest continuous monarchy in the world, stretching back over 1,500 years. But Japan was not isolated. Across the sea, powerful influences were stirring. From China and Korea came writing, Buddhism, philosophy, and advanced governance. Japan began absorbing these ideas, reshaping them into something uniquely its own. A civilization was emerging that would one day rival the greatest powers on earth. By the 6th century, Japan stood at the crossroads of transformation. From the Asian mainland came Buddhism, carried through Korea and China. It was more than a religion, it was a cultural revolution. Temples rose, scriptures were copied, and art flourished. Alongside Buddhism came the Chinese writing system, Confucian ideals, and models of government. Japan, once a loose collection of clans, was beginning to form into a unified state. The first great capital was established at Nara in 710. Modeled after the Tang dynasty's city of Chang'an in China, Nara was laid out in a grid, with palaces, temples, and administrative buildings. Here, Japan's emperors ruled as both political and spiritual leaders. Buddhism blended with Shinto, the native worship of kami, or nature spirits, creating a uniquely Japanese spiritual identity. In 794, the imperial court moved to a new capital, Heian-kyo, today known as Kyoto. This began the Heian period, one of the most celebrated ages of Japanese culture. Aristocrats of the Heian court lived in a world of elegance, poetry, and ritual. They wrote diaries and novels, painted delicate scrolls, and composed verses under the moonlight. The most famous creation of this time was The Tale of Genji, written by Lady Murasaki Shikibu. Often called the world's first novel, it tells of love, beauty, and life at court. Yet beneath the splendor of the Heian aristocracy, power was shifting. Local warriors landed samurai, were rising in influence. These were men of discipline, loyalty, and skill in battle. As imperial authority weakened, the samurai clans grew stronger and Japan's destiny began to fall into their hands. By the late 12th century, the country was plunged into war between two great clans, the Taira and the Minamoto. Their rivalry culminated in the Genpei War, a brutal conflict that ended in 1185 with the victory of the Minamoto. From this triumph emerged the first shogunate, a military government that would dominate Japan for centuries. The emperor remained, cloaked in divine prestige, but real power now belonged to the shogun. The capital shifted again, this time to Kamakura, marking the beginning of the Kamakura shogunate. It was during this era that Japan faced one of its greatest threats, the Mongol invasions. Twice, in 1274 and 1281, the armies of Kublai Khan attempted to conquer Japan. Vast fleets carried tens of thousands of warriors across the sea. And twice, Japan's defenders, aided by fierce storms, known as kamikaze, divine winds, repelled the invaders. These storms became legendary, seen as proof that the gods protected Japan. But internal strife and the burden of constant defense weakened the Kamakura shogunate. By the 14th century, Japan fractured once more. Rival warlords, known as daimyo, fought for land and power. The Muromachi period saw both cultural brilliance like the development of No theater and Zen gardens and devastating chaos as civil wars like the Onin War tore the country apart. This long age of conflict gave rise to one of the most dramatic chapters in Japan's story, the Sengoku period, or Warring States era. From the mid-15th to late 16th centuries, Japan was a battlefield of rival clans. Castles rose across the land, alliances shifted, and samurai armies clashed endlessly. Out of this turmoil would emerge three men who changed Japan forever. The first was Oda Nobunaga, a ruthless and brilliant warlord. Armed with new weapons, European firearms brought by Portuguese traders in 1543, Nobunaga crushed his enemies with unprecedented speed and brutality. He dreamed of unifying Japan under his rule. By the time of his death in 1582, he had conquered much of the country. Nobunaga's successor, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, continued the mission. Born a peasant, Hideyoshi rose through cunning and charisma to become one of Japan's greatest leaders. He completed the unification of Japan, introduced strict social hierarchies, and even launched invasions of Korea. Though his Korean campaigns failed, within Japan, his legacy was secure. He had brought peace after a century of chaos. After Hideyoshi's death, another figure rose to power, Tokugawa Ieyasu. In 1600, at the Battle of Sekigahara, he crushed his rivals and established the Tokugawa shogunate. For the next 250 years, the Tokugawa family would rule Japan from their capital in Edo, modern-day Tokyo. The Tokugawa era brought stability, peace, and isolation. Foreigners were largely expelled, Christianity was banned, and Japan entered a policy known as sakoku, or closed country. Trade was limited mainly to the Dutch and Chinese at Nagasaki. This isolation allowed Japan to preserve its traditions, develop its culture, and avoid the wars that devastated much of the outside world. Life in Tokugawa Japan was ordered and strict. The samurai stood at the top of society, though many became bureaucrats rather than warriors. Farmers, artisans, and merchants followed in rank. Yet it was the merchants, often considered the lowest, who grew increasingly wealthy as commerce thrived. Culture blossomed in new ways. The Tokugawa period gave rise to kabuki theater, colorful woodblock prints, known as ukiyo-e, and the art of the tea ceremony. Cities like Edo, Kyoto, and Osaka grew into bustling centers of life and creativity. But beneath this stability, change was brewing. By the mid-19th century, the world was knocking on Japan's door. Western powers, armed with steamships and modern weapons, demanded trade and diplomacy. In 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry of the United States arrived with a fleet of black ships, forcing Japan to open its ports. The shock was immense. For centuries, Japan had lived in relative isolation. Now it faced the reality of Western imperialism. This moment would ignite one of the most dramatic transformations in history, the Meiji Restoration. In 1868, the Tokugawa shogunate collapsed, and power was restored to the emperor. The young Emperor Meiji became the symbol of a new era. Determined not to be colonized, Japan launched a radical program of modernization. Feudal domains were abolished, samurai privileges were ended, and a national army was created. Railroads, telegraphs, and factories spread across the land. Japan adopted Western science, education, and industry but fused it with Japanese spirit. The Meiji era transformed Japan into a modern state within a single generation. By the early 20th century, Japan was no longer a target of imperialism. It had become an imperial power itself. Victories in the Sino-Japanese War, 1894 to 1895, and the Russo-Japanese War, 1904 to 1905, shocked the world. For the first time, an Asian nation had defeated a European empire. Japan had entered the ranks of the great powers. Yet with power came ambition. Japan expanded into Korea, Taiwan, and parts of China. Nationalism surged, and the military grew ever more influential. In 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, drawing the United States into World War II. For years, Japan waged a brutal war across Asia and the Pacific. But by 1945, after devastating bombings and mounting losses, Japan faced defeat. Then came Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The dropping of 2 atomic bombs forced Japan's surrender. The war had ended in unimaginable destruction. Out of the ashes, however, came rebirth. Under U.S. occupation, Japan adopted a new constitution. Its military was restricted, but its economy was rebuilt with astonishing speed. Factories roared back to life, cities were reconstructed, and technology became the engine of growth. By the 1960s, Japan had risen as an economic miracle, producing cars, electronics, and innovations that transformed the modern world. Culturally, too, Japan became a global force. From anime and manga to cuisine and fashion, Japanese culture spread worldwide. The rising sun flag, once a symbol of empire, was redefined as a mark of national pride and resilience. The struggles of history, the invasions, the wars, the defeats, were not forgotten, but they were transformed into the foundation of strength. Today, Japan stands as a nation of contrasts, ancient temples beside neon towers, centuries-old traditions alongside futuristic technology. It is a country that endured myth, war, devastation, and rebirth, and through it all, made its name in the world. Japan's story is not just the tale of one nation. It is a mirror of human resilience, of how people can rise, fall, and rise again. From the spear of the gods to the speed of a bullet train, Japan's journey is a reminder. Even the smallest islands can shape the destiny of the world. If Japan's journey from myth to empire, from ashes to rebirth moved you, then join us in keeping history alive. Hit that like button to honor the past, subscribe to never miss the stories that shaped our world, and share this video so others can see how Japan rose from its first day to today. And tell us in the comments what part of Japan's history amazed you the most. Your voice keeps this story going.